I started a secondary trauma group when I took office at the end of 2014. And I hired a facilitator who was an expert in secondary trauma and trauma. And I basically wanted him to teach my staff what it means to experience trauma. And then we worked in secondary trauma, and the whole thing really it pivoted then towards secondary trauma. There's several facets to this program, which I will talk about in a moment, but we kind of got this off the ground, and my folks who were on the edge of burnout and collapse, and the real stoic guys on my litigation team were the ones who were most profoundly affected and moved by it, the ones that I thought would be more resistant. They were skeptics at first, and then have now become my leaders for this program. We started with sort of targeting the most burnt out folks who had been around for years and decades. And now we incorporate the entire criminal staff, including support staff, paralegals, and brand new attorneys. So once it got off the ground, we got some awards through NACO. The top 100 most brilliant ideas in local government, or something that sounds really probably more impressive than it really is. But once we started getting that national recognition, then I was introduced to Mary Ashley, who is very involved with the women's section of NDAA, and we've kind of taken it from there. So my secondary trauma program, we call it STG, Secondary Trauma Group. It looks like this. There's 5 main components. And the first involves a 2-hour introduction where all of my criminal staff learns just the basic nuts and bolts about trauma and secondary trauma. And for most of them, it's a refresher course, but not all of it. There's always new aspects that they learn. So that's the larger group. And then we have a smaller group, which is the second component. We call it the development of group culture and trauma resiliency, where we take groups of 8 to 12, and then they meet once a month off-site at a really nice place, and work with a facilitator to actually learn resiliency skills and brain hacks, and learn about the neurobiology of stress. And it goes on for 6 months. Then at the end of that, we have our third component, which is an integration and impact. And basically we take what we learned during those 6 months and then bring it back to the office, and then once again, engage the larger group. And really what we're seeing is, at first there were these big shifts, the group that's in and the group that's out. And then, I mean, it was very defined when we were moving from phase to phase. Now we're so used to it, and it's become so ingrained in our office culture that it's much more subtle than that. We have a fourth component called a case-specific trauma response teams. And that's when we have, and I know that you all know exactly what I'm talking about, those particularly horrendous cases that pop up. And the investigative team, the initial prosecution team, they're all like sort of dealing with the immediate trauma. I'll give you an example. We, a couple years ago, had a case where a couple young people were abducted and killed and beheaded, and their bodies were put in tubs, and it was just a horrible, horrible situation for everybody involved. At the beginning. And so we ended up having one of these case-specific trauma response groups about 10 days after those bodies were initially discovered, to help folks, one, prepare for the future of what we were going to go through with this case, and to process what had happened to date. And that involved our firemen, our first responders, our investigative team, the hazmat folks. It involved all of the prosecutors. It was a very large group in that particular case, and so very helpful. Another case-specific trauma response example that sort of morphed into another new program involved a homicide trial that I did not too long ago, wherein the defendant had tortured his girlfriend over the course of a year and then stabbed her and left her up in the freezing woods outside Montana. It was below zero, where she succumbed to the weather before she would have died of her injuries. It was just horrible. Fact scenario. You know, we're, as prosecutors, working with those photographs every day. We're talking to witnesses about the horrible details of that case every day, meeting Charlie, the victim's young son, you know, her mother, her grandmother, the extended family. And it cumulatively builds on us, sometimes in a way that we don't recognize it because it's so gradual and incremental. What we didn't account for was the jury having this sort of internal collapse, having all of this horrific information thrown at them in the course of a very short period of time. It was about a 3-week trial. And the jurors, we forget, they can't talk to each other. They can't ask questions. They can't go home and talk to their loved ones. They can't visit the scene. They can't read anything about it. They're prohibiting from processing this information. Thankfully, we ended up getting a guilty verdict in that case. And then I ran into one of the jurors afterwards, and he happened to be the foreperson of the jury and told me that in the middle of the trial, he was having nightmares. He couldn't sleep. He was almost checked himself into the hospital. He was so bothered by it and was going to drop out. Thankfully, he didn't, barely. He made it through, but he was able to convince the other 11 jurors that they needed to convict this guy. So long story short, we had one of these case processing groups with the jury. 8 of them actually were excited about it and showed up. Our whole investigative team and then our whole prosecution team. It was really incredible to see they got to ask us questions, and it wasn't your usual, I'm going to interview the juror about constructive criticism. It was about, how did this affect you? What can we do to make it better for you? What, you know, they would say, what can we do to make it better for you? And it was really, it was an amazing result in the end. And we will certainly repeat that. And we have done so. And then the last piece of our secondary trauma group involves our leadership, vibrant leadership component. The last wave of folks that I sent through involved all of my chief deputies and my lead attorneys. And so it was a group of about 8. And basically they're learning not just leadership skills, but they're learning how to facilitate resiliency within the folks that they immediately supervise. So that has been amazingly helpful as well. And it's another piece that we're engaging into the future. How much time do I have left?
You're at 7 minutes now.
Oh, good. Okay. I also, in a kind of on a parallel track, I hired a resiliency coach and mindfulness teacher to come in and work with the rest of my staff. It's not my secondary trauma group. It's just building resilience and basic job stress, not necessarily criminal law stress. That has been really popular as well. Just learning tricks to deal with conflict, how to deal with various work situations, just the pressure of business in our worlds. We've also been working on this idea that I call the plausible work landscape, wherein it's a leader's responsibility to offer a landscape for young prosecutors and our staff that is survivable. And several of us know that lots of prosecutors' offices expect too much out of people. We really run them into the ground. And so through that initiative, we're looking at caseloads. We're making sure people get the support that they need, teaching the classes in resiliency. I also formulated a temporary position that is a more restful position. Obviously, the person still has to come to work and work, but for a 3-month period of time, they do this kind of less stressful rotation. It's mostly used by my SVU attorneys after a series of difficult cases. They just need a few months to do something different that is not quite so cerebral and challenging and confrontational. So that's been really kind of a neat thing that we've tried. We sort of have worked resiliency skills into our competencies, and we expect people to learn how to train their brains to be more resilient. And so once it's kind of woven into the competencies, and I'm still working on the language of that, but we're definitely have spread the idea of those expectations throughout the office. We can expect that of people then, and actually force them to do things that are good for them and for their brain, and take time off and when they need it, when we expect that sort of as a culture, as an office culture.
Sorry to interrupt, just a 5-minute warning.
Thank you. As you know, as most of you know, I am the chair of the Wellbeing Task Force of the NDAA, with Mary Ashley, my vice chair, and several of our board members, our task force members, are on this call. I see Nelson. Susan is our NDAA liaison. So we're working at kind of rolling out various well-being ideas for prosecutors on a national basis. We've been really busy and have seen some really great movement in this area, but obviously not enough. Our goal is to get every DA's office in the country to embrace this idea of prosecutor well-being, and promoting a landscape where folks can not just survive this business, but where they can thrive. If you want to see some of the work that we're doing, please check out our blog, and you can subscribe. It's a free subscription where you get notifications every time there's one of our weekly blog posts that come out on Wellbeing Wednesday. And that can be found at ndaajustice.medium.com.